My name is Mary Conquest. I'm your host for Safety Labs, the podcast where we explore the human side of safety to support safety professionals. We move past regulations and reportables to talk about the core skills of safety leadership: empathy, influence, trust, rapport. In other words, the soft skills that help you do the hard stuff. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Hi there. Welcome to Safety Labs. Safety managers work hard to identify and reduce risks, train new workers on safer ways to do their job, develop policy, and learn from incidents. What many safety managers have a lot of, and I'm thinking particularly of our listeners here, is enthusiasm to improve the safety of workers and their lives generally. What some safety managers don't have a lot of is support or understanding from the executive level of their organization. So that might mean that safety is siloed or that it simply doesn't have the budget to deliver as well as it could. Today's guest works with business leaders to support and educate them about worker health and safety. He knows how to speak executive and will share his insight into the way leaders view organizational safety. François Barton has been chief executive of the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum since 2015. Prior to joining the forum, François established and ran WorkSafe New Zealand's national program team, which has delivered major safety campaigns in construction, agriculture, forestry, and manufacturing. He previously held roles at MBIE and at the Department of Labor, where he was part of the team that originally established the Business Leaders Health and Safety Forum in 2010. And François joins us from Wellington, New Zealand. Welcome.
Nice to be here, Mary.
Can you give me a little bit of background? How did you end up leading? Were you founding or were you one of the founders of the National Safety Leadership Forum, or how did that come about for you?
I mean, there may be a few sort of occupational health and safety puns on the way through here, so I'll get the first one out of the way early. I fell into it by accident. Before I joined the Department of Labor in New Zealand, which is where the health and safety regulator was positioned, I'd worked in the Ministry for the Environment around sustainable industry. So and I was working with the tourism portfolio, and for anyone that's familiar with New Zealand, obviously a clean green image is a really critical part of our tourism offering. And so our work was partnering with industry to tourism industry around getting environmentally sustainable business practice and profitability sort of correlated. When I stepped into the into the Department of Labor around health and safety, it very quickly felt to me that health and safety was sort of a human social sustainability part of the same approach. How can we use our commitment to people's health and safety in a way that delivers against a sustainability bottom line, but around business? But I was in a policy role. And so, when the old saying is, when the only tool you've got is a hammer, every problem becomes a nail. I found myself very quickly appreciating the role of the hammer around good regulation, legislative expectations, and enforcement. But it didn't naturally speak to me. I was new to it. And so the role of leadership, the role of culture and leadership and performance became very interesting for me. And so I had some space in the Department of Labor at that time to sort of start looking at, well, what's the state of leadership in New Zealand around health and safety? And it was really at a delegated fourth management tier level of leadership in New Zealand. It wasn't really an issue that sat at the top table. There were very few legislative drivers to require it to go to the top. And so I sort of stole a line off Kevin Costner, and me and a few colleagues within the organization said, well, shall we build it and see if they come? And so me and a bunch of colleagues from within the Department of Labor and our National Worker Compensation Insurance Organization, ACC, and some friends in industry, we just started slowly having some conversations. And so that was the origins of this idea of saying, does leadership count? Yes. Have we got enough of it? No. Hey, senior leaders, are you willing to play a role? And so it was a question we posited rather than a thing we demanded. And so I'll say I was pleasantly surprised that actually there was a real appreciation. Actually, this is important and it does sit at the top table, but we're not quite sure how. And so, yeah, so that was sort of the origins back in 2009, 2010. And so whilst I was in a policy role within the department at the time, my relationship with the forum is one that I do feel I'm a co-founder alongside a bunch of other colleagues and friends in industry and in government.
You've heard, I think, you mentioned last time we spoke that you've heard from CEOs and from safety managers that they have a passion for safety, and you have feelings about that phrase. So maybe just explain those and let me know why you think it could be problematic.
I have a view that I often say I'm not French, I'm not a safety expert, and I'm not passionate about safety. And one of them's supposed to be funny, the other's trying to clarify what I don't have, and the other's trying to be a little bit provocative. Because I suggest probably 20 years in, I probably am passionate about safety. I guess for me, the challenge I have with passion is it's what passion can do is it can help fuel you. It can give you energy. It can let you crawl over broken glass in the name of passion. We have crimes of passion. We have fits of passion. You think about the words we co-locate with passion. They're amazing, but they are red. And and for me, what that means is judgment. Judgment is often sacrificed when passion takes over. And so to be in a situation either when I'm talking with health and safety professionals in a different way than when I'm talking with chief executives, when they start, continue and finish with passion as the red thread, and red's probably the right color here, the red thread of their safety work, what I sometimes worry about is the judgment and the focus on the material things we know that make a difference. So I often suggest I'm not passionate about safety. I care about it more than that. We need to be, I think there's a range, because the thing is, I might be passionate about it, but anyone that's been inundated with a friend or colleague or relative at the end of a boozy Christmas lunch, who's got a passionate belief about a sports team, a political party, or a verse out of the Bible, I don't know, take your pick. If you're not on the same page as them, it doesn't really resonate. They can talk to you 5 times as loud and twice as long, and you're not going to be any further down the path. So I think a huge element of leadership of people in across organizations, and I think about when we really get to the core of what do we mean when we talk about health and safety, is it's not one thing, it's lots of things. It sits in a complex dynamic context. That's why I love it so much. And everybody that you need to talk to who has a role to play, and we'll probably come back to this idea about clarity of role, they're going to have a different door to knock on to be relevant to their role. And if you hit it with passion and passion only, to be honest, I just see a lot of people get turned off, where here comes the safety guy or girl, and they care about it a whole lot. So let's almost give them a place where they can get it out of their system while we get on with the important work of running the organization. And for CEOs, it's like passion's great, but your role's more balanced and important than that. So focus, be balanced. Let's get material about this. So, and I think if there's a conversation that might maybe might bring us into, sooner or later, Mary, I'll let you steer that. A really material element of leadership as distinct from management is the importance of context over content.
That was literally my next question. Yeah. So what I had is that you shared with me a phrase last time we spoke that I'm not sure if you heard it from a CEO or where you heard it, but leadership is context and management is content. So yes, please elaborate what you mean by that.
Yeah, well, I was in a small group of some senior safety executives and a New Zealand former chief executive of Z Energy, which bought all of Shell's downstream oil assets, was a New Zealand startup, and a guy called Mike Bennett's very impressive chief executive. And that was his expression. He said that, and by the way, these aren't binary, the idea that leadership's context and management's context and one is better than the other and they're completely distinct. But the idea, if we think about this as a continuum, that understanding what else is going on, understanding what are the drivers and issues and challenges that people have around the table, what are the issues the organization is confronting, or what's the context we want to create, very much sits in the leadership space. Management is about how do we then move what's in the boxes to where we need them to be. Now, it's really, really important to do that, but otherwise you can have the most beautiful read of the context and ambition, but if you can't actually execute to make things happen, it's a nice idea, but you don't get where you need to be. What really resonated with me around this idea of leadership being context, management being content, is it made me reflect of, at that point, I'd done probably 10 years in the regulator and in this space. And it just made me realize how much of the safety conversations do I hear safety folk having with executives and with anybody talking as anyone about safety. What's the weighting between what's in the box, the content of safety, versus the context within which safety gets made real or emerges from? And there's no science to this, but my intuition and my experience was, I'll be interested whether this chimes with your viewers or not, it's about 90-10 content over context every day of the week. So we spend a lot of conversations talking about the content of safety, the systems, the management, the processes, all that stuff, and it's not important. But if you've not knocked on the right door and read the context that I'm operating in, and you've hit that conversation with passion, and your priority is, whilst important, doesn't align with the other 5 things I've got to go with, how are you going to get to continuing to push what's in the box rather than putting the box down and being really curious to understand what's going on in the context I'm going into? And when that was shared with me, how I look to engage with groups just changed overnight. From worrying about what I was going to say, which I'd often write these screeds of longhand notes, because as you'll see, I like the spoken word, and if I'm not disciplined, I can go on and on and on. But spending 80% of my time going, who am I talking to? What are their issues and agendas? What's going on around them? To help them really contextualize, because I had no shortage of things to say, but how do I put them into a context where what's in the box is understood? So I found that transformational for me, and I think there's a really good shared challenge, I think, for us, for those closer into the functional side of the safety spaces. Again, we might be passionate. It may be our number one priority, but the likelihood of it being everyone else's isn't the likelihood. That doesn't make them bad people. Their context is different to ours. So how do we understand that?
Well, in the intro, I said, you speak executive, which is it's a bit cheeky, but I think that's exactly what you're getting at, is speaking, whether it's executive or whatever, to someone in another role, is really about understanding their priorities and trying to place your message within that. This is not exactly changing your message, but it's contextualizing it in a way that will feel important to them so that they will listen. Is that what you're getting at?
Mm. Yeah, I think there's a really nice nuance you're pulling out there. This is because one of the things, if I recall what Mike shared with me in that conversation, was, he said, as chief executive of this business from its commencement, he said, I know a lot about this business. What I'm not lacking is knowledge of content. But if I'm going to speak to a group of investors versus a group of my staff members during a reorganization, or I'm talking to a group of regulators, the context is different to those. So he goes, I spend time wondering what's going on behind the people I'm talking to, and what does that require of me? Do they need confidence? Do they need to see vulnerability? Do they need to see a level of urgency, or do they need to see calmness? Now, what none of that is about, I think, is it can't be about inauthenticity. It's not painting on a smile, but it is just being really attentive. And so very often in a safety space, particularly if you're talking to senior teams, they're often that you might be wanting to, actually, I need to create a level of tension and discomfort here. That if I'm sensing maybe the context I'm getting is an overconfidence from my executive team or board, right, what I need to do that, and I know why that's going on, but actually I think I need to turn up and bring a level of tension in here. Or actually, we're doing really well. They're worried about a whole bunch of lost time injuries climbing up, and they want me to jump on that at the expense of us managing some really important critical risks. I need to come in and I need to be authoritative and calming. That might be it's maybe a little lazy example, but in both cases, you're wanting to get on with the important work that ensures your resources and energy and people's effort go in the right area. But if you've got a board in 2 different situations and executives in 2 different contexts, one way of being is going to hopefully speak to them in a way that's going to be more useful for you getting what you need from them, which is either some space so you can get on with it, or some engagement so you can get some resourcing from it. And there's a lot of nuance, and that's hugely stimulating. Like it's never the same twice. And I think once you start to, and a ton of people on this podcast will be across this already. So, but I think there'd be agreement. It's a really stimulating set of skills and capabilities to develop, and straight health and safety management, particularly when you've got the anvil of a regulatory regime under it to in a way bash people against them, it's an additional tool in the kit beyond the hammer and the anvil.
In a way, speaking a different language, like executive, if you will, is about, that's a skill in and of itself, is understanding the context and understanding the subtext of how you're speaking, not just what you're saying. But in order for safety professionals to have better conversations with executives, you mentioned that the complexity that CEOs deal with is breadth, right? They have this very broad view. What should a safety professional keep in mind? Like, do you have any, it sounds facile to say tips and tricks, but what would you like safety managers to know about starting or having effective conversations with CEOs that you think, or that you suspect maybe a lot of them don't know?
Well, I want to be able to acknowledge, and people may have gleaned from my your very generous intro of me, Mary. I'm not a technical health and safety person, nor French, by the way, as I think I've clarified earlier. And I sometimes cheekily say I'm unencumbered and unburdened by technical capability, would be how I frame that as a strength. But I just want to acknowledge, I often speak from a position with all care and no responsibility. So I just want to acknowledge the seats. I know a number of the people that are watching this podcast are sitting in a serious, are challenged and challenging environments to do what they do in. So I just want to acknowledge that so anything I share is not, you need to listen to me. These are just things that I guess my roles have exposed me to and that I've seen work. I think this, if we talk about just, I guess, appreciating the understanding of the contextual piece, I mean, one, I think what that can do is it can allow you to hold in your head, you know why you're going to talk to an executive or a board. You either need their support for something, you want to bring something to their attention so that they can maybe provide some energy or some resources to it. You might just want to keep them in whatever that is, you're going in with that. But by being curious about the context, it just lets you knock on the right door, the right sort of modality of, what do they need to hear for you to be able to hear what comes next? And I think sometimes what happens is that door can get closed pretty quick when you turn up with all of the content and all that you have that you want to talk about. And I think, and my sense is having just recently spent some time in the US, Netherlands, and the UK, as well as friends and colleagues in Australia, I think there's a similar brand challenge health and safety professionals have everywhere, that there's a lot of preconditions of what people think they're about, and it's not always true. So I think that idea of starting with questions and eliciting, so what's going on? What's top of your mind at the moment? Lets you understand the organizational context so that you might be able to, that's helpful. And that can be, sometimes you can do that in advance, but sometimes even doing that in the room. So I think that's useful. But I think the other reason why I think it's such a critical prerequisite for an effective health and safety leader, whatever level they're at, is safety doesn't exist in isolation. Safety is not done, and I'm telling everyone, I'm bringing Cole to Newcastle in this podcast, but safety is an emergent quality that sits in the weave of work, and your chief executive and the respective executives you speak to are all sort of owners of or authorities around one of those levers that create the environment for work to either be safe or not safe, to be productive or not productive. And so that ability to be able to sort of actually, when you're engaging across the organization, the ability to put it into context means they can clearly see you're curious in their world on how you can then help, rather than them needing to come into a complete, because it can be quite an intimidating world, the world of health and safety acronyms and language, and particularly if you've then got that legal compliance anvil on the side there, it can be all of a sudden quite a tense conversation. I'm not giving you the tips and trips. I just guess I'm coming back to the why that's important. And I think
I think you are actually. But
right. Well, I was just going to say the other one, and this is going to sound facile. So again, this is unapologetically me taking ownership of this. Like for the last 3 or 4 years, this is after 10 years in my role, I've just sort of reverted back to asking some really cool questions at the front end of some conversations with boards, with execs, with frontline workers, red meat processing workers. So like literally the same conversation at different levels. And the question is this: when I say health and safety, what do you think? And I pause, and if I've done that in a room full of 300 people, and I gave everybody 2 minutes, and I let them do it in pairs, and I've done that around a board table of a New Zealand Stock Exchange listed board of directors, and with executive teams. And because I've asked them, what do you think, not what it is, there's no wrong answer. I've started with a question. That's not then the expert coming in and telling, because again, my suspicion is the expectation when a safety person comes in is, well, strap in, we're going to be told some stuff. And what almost universally is the case is there's a real diversity of things that people think of when I say health and safety. Things that'll be very familiar globally. There'll be a whole bunch of outcome things that pop into people's minds. It'll be death or injury, or it might be a wonderful return to home at the end of the day, or it might be a supportive culture. There might be a bunch of sort of input process type things that people, road cones, checklists, blame, accountability, handbrakes, too much cotton wool, wrapped around in cotton wool, red tape. The reason I ask that question and let the conversation flow is it lets me sit there and say, hey guys, all I said was health and safety. I said health, safety, and you gave me these 8 different things, 10 different things, 15 different things. And what that tells me is we all assume we know what we're talking about when we talk about health and safety, because you all turned up here to listen to me or talk to me or clink into a podcast like people have done today. Yet if you think health and safety is a compliance handbrake, and you think health and safety is the sign of a good culture, and yet we all think that's health and safety, you two are never going to be on the same page over what we're doing. And if I think it's about critical risk management, no one's right. So what contextualizing can do, and taking the time to ask what can seemingly be obvious question, is it gets you a chance to test, what do you think I'm here to talk about? And why I think that's particularly useful for everyone is if you're one of the grumpy old grey-bearded guys around the table, and often are guys that have had a guts full of all of this conversation, it's all gone too far. And the first part of the conversation has been asked what they think, not judged, and been given an alternative way of thinking of it. My experience is that's almost a novel experience for a lot of senior people. And I've learned a lot about what they think, and that gives me permission to say, well, what about if we thought about it like this? And it then provides an invitation for me in that space to be able to put something else on the table. Well, I've asked your opinion. Do you want to hear mine? And I've found that it just creates a little bit of space, a little bit more space to be nicely being open to maybe seeing a different perspective. Now, this isn't the day-to-day sort of conversations people are having, but my view is people all think they're in violent agreement of what health and safety is. And actually, my experience is there's 58,000 different permutations of what everyone thinks we're going to talk about. And where I challenge senior leaders, and where I think there's a real opportunity for health and safety functional leads to play a role, is the privilege of leadership as we get to frame the language. The privilege of leader is this. How do we bring it together? So how do we do that? Well, we certainly don't do it by telling people. We do it by how do we first get a sense of where are we at, and then can we build a space in the middle?
I want to ask you more about that in a minute, but before we move on, it's time to hear from the company behind the podcast, Safety Products Global. We've all had the experience of cutting something and it did not go quite as planned. In manufacturing and construction, this happens all the time, and it's a laceration risk. The Pacific Handy Cutter Smart Retract Victa, which I'm holding up for my audio people, is a heavy-duty knife with the same cutting depth and power as standard knives. It can handle triple-walled corrugate, but it also has built-in intelligence. The smart blade retraction automatically pulls the blade back the moment it loses contact with the cutting surface, even if the squeeze trigger is still engaged. Its ergonomic and glove-friendly squeeze trigger helps reduce hand fatigue. Tool-free blade change keeps downtime to a minimum. And if you want to learn more about which tools will work for your materials, You can request free samples by going to safetylabspodcast.com/samples. And now back to our show. Just before we took a break there, you were talking about the privilege of leadership. And it makes me think of contextualizing and framing things. And last time we spoke, you talked about mindset. Mindset drives what we talk about and what we do. So what kinds of mindsets have you seen are particularly helpful and or particularly unhelpful in the kinds of conversations that you've had around safety?
Well, I think that question I use around, I say safety, you'd think what is just a very, very simple, accessible and scalable way of just doing enough of a little peek into behind the door about how are people thinking about things. Because as you say, I think there's about 1,500 million definitions of leadership. The one that we adhere to, that I find has both got some good evidence behind it and worked, is that our mindsets drive our language and our language drive our practice. So I think often, again, we often don't reflect or interrogate mindset enough. It can often be considered navel gazing and maybe a little ethereal, but it is so material. And what that I say safety, you think what conversation elicits is, I said two words that are evidently common and you've all got completely different views on it. Do you understand it? Because if I think safety is a sign of good culture, I'll talk about engagement and I'll have my actions will be a lot of frontline engagement with people doing the work. If I think health and safety is compliance and I don't tell anyone, I'll talk about audits and have we ticked something off, and I'll make sure I'm checking those all of the time. Now, neither of those are wrong, but you want the idea of mindset and language and practice being aligned. You can see how those don't go there. So the idea of being able to elicit that from people, I think, has always afforded me, I've taken a level of permission to say, okay, well, look, yes, safety is a legal obligation. That's a legitimate mindset. And it is the absence of harm, which is also true. We don't want to see people harm. So when we have the absence of harm, that's a good thing. But one's about compliance and one's about statistics. When I think of examples I've seen in New Zealand, and I've been privileged enough to rub shoulders and talk to guys like Todd Conklin in the US, Rob Fisher and his team, his human organizational team in the US, really, really good operators up in the UK, guys like Graham Skinner at OE UK and others. The mindsets I see present where good things are happening in business and sector and countries, consciously or unconsciously, is an appreciation that safety is actually a positive outcome of good work. Safety is not a thing, it's an outcome, and safety is a good thing. Safety is important. How many people did we kill doesn't quite resonate for me. So safety is a positive outcome of work going well, and I'll come back to why that's useful, why I think it's powerful. The other mindset that's present, and they're correlated, is that it's the presence, not the absence. It's the presence of capacity in your organization so that when people fail, not if, they can fail safely. And that's in New Zealand become a conversation really anchored around the idea of critical risk management that sits in there. But the mindset is, what are the things we proactively make happen so that when people fail, the result of that failure isn't something terribly serious or a fatality. And what those two mindsets, I've seen how they turn up is the idea of safety as a positive outcome of work going well. So that's borrowed out of some Safety 2, Safety Differently, New View world, and human organizational performance. But it provides a really clear signal that you want to be interested in the work. And as a senior leader, the more I understand around what work looks like around here, not what I want it to be, not what we've written down in SOPs, not what we've written in job descriptions, not what we've written in our work schedule or sales targets, but what we actually see out there, gives me the indication of, well, have we set the table well for our people to do good, reliable, safe, quality, productive work? And I identify those 5 things because guess what? There's a whole ton of other things that are positive outcomes of work going well. And if I'm an executive where my complexity is breadth, not depth, and you're telling me you mean safety is an aligned concept or practice that relates to other good things in the organization. Now, again, I'm telling people on this call something they already know, but I still think a broad number of executives, that's still a bit of an earth-shattering realization when you can start to demonstrate that. So the ability to sort of put that mindset in, what that then means is how as executives do we get that view of what real work looks like? And so there's a ton of really interesting ideas and practices that can plug you into learning from the front line, and we can talk about that. But I think what it allows you to also do from an organizational resourcing perspective, if safety is an outcome of good work, the safety manager isn't the only framer of good work. All of a sudden, your CFO is a really critical player, not because safety is everyone's responsibility, but because CFOs have a call about where do we spend our money and what do we invest in. The CPO brings HR to the table. How do we recruit? How do we develop? How do we train? What does organizational justice look like in this organization? What's our organizational design look like? So all of a sudden that definition actually includes meaningfully, why are you important? Well, because safety is not this, safety is this. And so I think that's an incredibly powerful mindset that you can continue to leverage and deliver stuff off the back of that mindset for a lifetime in terms of where it takes you as a senior leader.
And I think that gets at a little bit of my next question, which is about why, which may sound like an obvious question, like why? Why do we care that we're trying to connect with the C-suite? Like why does it matter? And I think the answer to that is the answer to this question, which is, what are the levers that only the CEO and the executive team can pull for safety? Because there are some that no matter how great a safety professional you are, that you simply can't pull. So I guess this is the motivation behind making those connections.
Totally. And this isn't a universal truth, but I mean, I think one of the things I've loved about a decade of working with senior teams, again, we're a not-for-profit, so I'm not doing that in a consultancy way. I don't sell any further services, so I'm often in the sort of connect and engage piece. Is not universally, but broadly speaking, they're really capable people. So actually it doesn't take a lot to sometimes just actually shift the mindset to provide people, okay. Right. Okay. So then from the functional team, we're able to then that's not down to me, by the way, but this shift about seeing safety as a compliance thing that's done versus a positive outcome of work. It doesn't take smart people much to realize what that means and how that can help. So I can think of, and I just think we over assume that smart people can join those dots if we've not helped them. But if 90% of their experiences when a safety person or a lawyer or an expert or a consultant turns up as content conversation, not context conversation, and they don't start with asking me, A, what's my starting belief, or B, what else is going on in the organization, you can see why they wouldn't have joined this dot. And so when I've seen some organizations, again, where passion has been the overriding energizer or lever over context, is I've seen CFOs and CPOs and others go, well, why are you asking it to do my role? Why have we got the health and safety manager if you're asking me to have it as my role? We've got someone whose job this is, just like I'm in charge of finance, you're in charge of safety. But if we've got a mindset that is actually evidence-based, true, that safety is an outcome of good work, all of a sudden we're just helping them see what that means. And so an example, and we've got a really lovely video case study on our website, which I know we'll talk to at the end, Mary, around a major transmission grid operator in New Zealand that was having issues with its contracting workforce around tower painting. So these big steel towers that everyone in the world can recognize, they need to be abrasively blasted and coated with paint to protect them from corrosion. And no matter how much safety direction came from the client to these contractors, and it was all, again, the road to hell is paved with good intention. There was no problem with the intention or the quality of what they were saying. When they tried to use the safety tool more, the safety performance got worse, counterintuitive. And the literal embodiment and expression of this for good intention and each individual issue being appropriately dealt with in isolation was that these tower painters were wearing 5 levels of protective equipment that weighed 20 kilograms. I don't know what that is in US pounds, but 20 kilos, which is a lot. Before you then carry up a big, heavy sandblasting lance and a bucket with toxic paint in it, and you climb up 60 meters in the middle of winter or in the middle of summer. And when that organization, who implicitly were across this idea of these are outcomes of work, what's going on, and the question shifted of their workforce to tell us about what we like to work for, not how do we make you safer, what do we like to work for? The answer was, and I won't give you the full the Kiwi expressions of how this was expressed, which was pretty direct and blunt, but it was like, you're nice people, but you're missing the mark because it takes 2 years to train a tower painter. You give us a 3-month contract. We have specialist heavy equipment that's got to go off-road into isolated areas on narrow farm tracks. We've got to invest in specialist transport. You give us a 3-month contract. And what's more, those contracts get turned on and off. Do you know what you like to work for? You're not bankable. That's the problem. And so because Transpower, this client, are a smart, reputable, mature organization, what they didn't do was shoot the messenger. They listened. And the CFO and COO said, we're not giving you more money and we're not changing our standards, but how about we go to 3 to 18-month contracts? Why don't we give you a longer contract? And within 12 months of that decision, within 12 months, injury rates declined. Productivity in terms of square meters of towers maintained increased. Price stayed the same. Innovation grew. All of a sudden, they were one of the contractors partnered with an outdoor clothing specialist and using high-tech Kevlar and other forms of modern, developed a 1-layer 3.6 kilo set of overalls that performed to the same safety standards as the 20 kilo 5-layered system over here. It's now an industry standard. It was an export product for the company that designed it, not because anyone asked for it, but because the context for good work to occur was created. And the health and safety manager wasn't part of that decision at all, because they can't be, because this was a contracting, tenure and commercial decision. And so it's a story I share almost weekly, because if you want to be able to demonstrate by understanding the context, which they thought was, you're not understanding the safety. No, we do. You're not understanding our environment. And it wasn't just give us more money, it was give us more certainty. Now, that's not the answer, but in that context, it was. And the outcomes were productivity and innovation and safety and reputational social risk, because these assets work through private land. And that was 8 years ago I heard of that story. That innovation has continued and delivered into work-related ill health and a whole lot of other good outcomes. And so the beauty of changing the context, not just the individual control, was it's like teaching a man or a woman to fish versus giving them a fish. You shift the environment and actually you get these rising tide benefits. So that is a concrete example. Nothing's made up in that. That was real. And I don't think at the start they were using my mindset language, but boy, it is so self-evident that that's what was going on. And so I think what that does is it lets senior people not feel lectured to and morally blackmailed into saying what they think they should do, which is safety is our number one priority and I'm passionate about it. It lets them understand, okay, so if the lever is a commercial one and a CFO role, I'm relevant. Okay, I get that. And I get the benefit out the other end. Well, I definitely get that. So I think it's how do we hang better examples and stories in our organizations about to paint and find those situations where we can highlight the relevance of those various players. And that's why safety at the top table is important, not just because senior leaders are important, because there's only one table in any organization that has full mandate to pull those levers, and it's the top one. So we've got to help them understand why, not with lecturing them or threatening them with the law, but actually there's a range of things going on here as a team. So I think that for me, Mary, is the piece is you've got to give them, if you want people to shift their mind. Rob Fisher from Fisher Improvement Technologies in North Carolina shared this with me, and it sits very true with how I view the world. If you want to shift people's perspective, you've got to start with where they're at. And from there you can then give them something better to take them forward. And I think testing the context, that's where they're at. And how about this? And give them another alternative frame. And sometimes I think when we rely and when we're unsure, the ease of falling back into, well, the law says we have to. Or here's volumes and volumes of industry best practice that we need to for peer group reasons. They're necessary and they're true. They're just woefully insufficient. And unless you're constantly pushing and hammering those things, I just don't think it endures and sustains.
I think when you were saying that, If you say to someone, I need to change your mind to this, and subtext, I don't care what you think now, what they're going to understand is what you think right now is not important. You're not important. I'm important, and you need to come over to my side. Whereas you were talking about starting where they are, acknowledges that they're there for a reason. They didn't just, their point of view is valid, and you'd like to sort of build on that and add alternatives.
I mean, just for clarity, I mean, if we've just had 3 fatalities over the last 6 months, I'm the chief executive of that organisation, and I'm still holding on to my view, and you're coming in to give me a serious tensioning conversation because the regulator's already been there, and it's likely we're going to be prosecuted several times, and you as an officer might be in real hot water. That's a situation where I think that's a different context to one of us being in an organisation that we're broadly okay. We know we can do better. So again, I think you're so right, though. I think so. Sometimes their perspective mightn't be valid, and 3 fatalities in 6 months would suggest maybe there's some issues with how they're viewing things. But so I think your premise, though, is bang on point. Bang on point.
So your forum brings together chief executives across industries. What do CEOs, or how can CEOs learn from each other about safety, like from each other, that they can't or maybe don't easily learn from their own internal teams or maybe from consultants? What's the power of having them speak with each other?
The sort of little call to action or the intervention model that sits in my mind is the idea of the forum's work is connecting leaders to share and learn. I think that's the little premise. We connect people with purpose, and it's to share what's going on and learn from one another. And actually, I don't think it's a universal thing for chief executives. You go to a health and safety conference, you see a whole bunch of people enjoying learning from each other. I think the idea of being able to connect with a group of colleagues who understand your context, if we come back to that context word, they understand the shoes I'm walking in principally. I think that's almost a universal truth. So I think at one level, there's just that. I think very often what I would observe is that CEOs are often, when they're engaging with other leaders, it's very often, understandably, in explicit sector contexts or in supply arrangements or commercial arrangements, which is cool. But what's the context of those? What tends to happen, particularly in those sector conversations, is there's a whole bunch of other issues getting dealt with around market access and tariff responses, dare I say it, in the modern world, or how do we deal with disrupted supply chains? It'll be very specific to the nature of their sector. And sometimes there's a big political element to that. And there's the old adage that it's lonely at the top, that, it's lonely being a CEO. And I think some say that's not true. Some say it's true. I think what is true is that the CEO's role, they need to be appropriately confident and clear in front of their teams. And they need to be on top of it for their board. And they need to be inclusive amongst their leadership crew. And so there's not a lot of space for vulnerability in that area. Well, there is and there isn't. It's quite a special leadership skill to be able to access the right level of vulnerability without making people going, cry, are they okay? And so I think what the forum affords is, we're 450 chief executives across New Zealand. So we're the largest chief executive group in the country, full stop, around health and safety. So we can give everyone a high five for that. We've been around for 15 years. 25% of New Zealand's workforce, given the size of our country, which is small, report to one of our CEO members. So there's a shadow there. But we're pan-industry, transport, port, logistics, construction, forestry, farming, government, local government, central government, manufacturing, retail, the whole lot. And so when you're connecting at that level, the temptation to get sucked into very, very sector-specific or supply chain-specific issues is just less, because it's not right. As a retail CEO, I don't really understand that, Mr. Forestry or Mrs. Forestry CEO. So it forces the conversation up to what are the universal fundamentals of leading people, of leading organizations, and translating that intention into genuine care. And so I think what part of the contextual piece that we do is we just create an environment where we're forced to go to a point where we have to talk about those commonalities across chief executive leadership. I think CEOs will, and because we're not a consultancy, I indicated before we're not for profit, they're also confident we're not going to sell them anything. We're not bringing them together to basically lull them towards, there is a membership subscription every year, but it's modest. I don't have an app to sell them. I don't have an ongoing subscription service to offer them. So I think there's something about that environment that's useful. And the fact that we've been around for as long as we have, and we've only had 2 CEOs in that time, is that there's a level of trust and confidence that we're here to help. We've got a regulator. The regulator's job is to do the inquisition, the investigation, and if need be, the accountability piece. We're not a technical group. We're not the business specialists or business managers lead at the safety forum. We're the business leaders. So again, we've kind of defined where we're interested in talking about. And so without triggering anyone who's anti-woke on the call, it's a safe place to talk and safe place to connect. And I feel very proud about the work we've done about that. So I think it's no surprise CEOs learn best from each other, because that's the reality for all of us. And I think we take them to a place where they just can't speak to maybe the predisposed specifics that would sometimes take safety off the agenda, and we'll talk about something else. What we've increasingly, last piece on this though, Mary, because I'm conscious I don't want to do all the talking. What we've increasingly started to do is also acknowledge the best sharing and best learning isn't usually about the hero move that went perfectly first time. And no one really wants to stand up in front of 100 colleagues and say, I really mucked up and I got it all wrong. So what we've also started to do is actually come up with a fuller range of engagements, from more structured and formal ones to more intimate roundtable conversations, and sometimes even just one-on-one with me and a bunch of these people, where we can really encourage a space where we can share about what was intended and what happened, and then what the lesson of that. So we've had one chief executive experience. There was no fatality, thank goodness, but a major structural failure as part of the work they were doing. So we held a small intimate lunch where he was able to share with a group of sales what was it like leading through that level of front newspaper challenge. Still was integrity, still was effective leadership and all those other things, still with accountability, even though there was no major fine or no one was prosecuted. So I think sometimes group size matters. Sometimes it's a broadcast conversation. Sometimes it's an energizing conversation. Sometimes it's, hey, what's hard? So I think my view would be we've always been very responsive to always trying to plug into what's going on in the world and just evolve and respond accordingly. And fortunately, the support of our members has afforded us that opportunity over 16th year we're in now. So
I wanted to ask about a specific potential turning point. You were active in 2020 at the time of a catastrophic mine explosion that killed 29 men, the Pike River mine. You talked to me about how that represented a choice. How are business leaders going to think about safety in the role of this shocking event, like shocking in a cultural, like for the nation, I believe. I mean, I'm not in New Zealand, but yeah. How did that affect it? And how did people take the opportunity to maybe shift their mindset or think about safety in terms of business leadership rather than siloed?
totally, it was fascinating because it was 20. When you said 2020, I thought COVID was going to be the example you talked about, which was so the Pike River explosion was in 2010.
Oh, 2010. I'm sorry.
2010. No, and what was interesting was I was in the Department of Labour at the time, which included mine safety as part of our regulatory oversight. And the then chief, so Pike River Pike River mine was a mine on the southwest coast of New Zealand, very rugged and very isolated. And interestingly, it was a mine in a conservation estate, and our Department of Conservation, so it was in protected environmental land, and so had needed to be an incredibly innovative mine design, so it minimized its environmental footprint and meant it used a whole lot of unorthodox mining methods that meant issues of methane management and gas in this mine, which are really critical elements of underground mining, needless to say, are managed safely. It was sort of a poster child for the brave new world of how we can eat our cake and have it too. We can extract coal, we can do it in a national park, we can do it innovatively and productively, and until it went bang and 29 men were killed. The chief executive of that organization was actually one of our stalwart founding members that I was working with intimately as we were standing the forum up, and we actually launched the forum in July that year, 2010. And in November 2010, the mine exploded. And I kind of felt there was, at the time, I sort of thought this, especially given the chief executive's seat around our table, and this is either going to blow this conversation off the table, or it's going to be the making of us. And so what we were never were a fig leaf of corporate response in the face of an industrial tragedy. But I think what we did become, and what I saw the country sort of deal with from a leadership perspective, is going, actually, this is real. This is something things actually can go wrong, and when they can go wrong, they can go terribly wrong. Politically, there was a royal commission. We're obviously part of the Commonwealth, so a royal commission is sort of the highest level of public inquiry you can do. So there was a royal, and we had a conservative government at the time, which I think objectively would be fair to say their natural home isn't going into industrial relations and improving safety standards as their first item of their policy agenda. But to their credit, they engaged a Royal Commission around mine safety and this explosion in particular, but didn't leave it there. They also commissioned an independent task force, a national task force, to look at actually our health and safety performance generally. So they didn't just look at mine safety, which is a very small but dangerous subject. Actually, how are we going? And that was actually an incredibly foundational experience. I was in the regulator at the time. We realised and acknowledged we'd been part of that systemic failure. We realised our legislative framework, which comes off the UK outcomes-based regulatory framework, same as in Canada and Australia and in New Zealand, we'd not implemented the necessary regulations that underpin that legislation. We'd not done the good codes of practice, and our regulator had been asleep at the wheel, all as a function of a whole bunch of political agendas over the previous 15 years, by the way. So out of that was a national recognition that in order for that not to happen again, we need an independent health and safety regulator, not one sitting in the Department of Labour or the then, you said MBIE, that was the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment. Now, the regulator needs to be WorkSafe. It needs to be independent. We need to bring our health and safety legislation into the 21st century, so let's redo that. And we need to grow and build leadership, and so we were up and running. And what we saw over the following 4 to 5 years was a really sustained investment across government and into business around this becoming a material issue of national importance. I wish I could say we'd continue to endure that, continue that level of shared priority and focus going forward. I think there are elements where absolutely it has. As a country, the result of how we've done it is the idea of safety sitting at the top table. And one of the regulatory changes was creating officer duties for the company officer, so boards of directors and chief executive having a personal liability to proactively ensure due diligence of the organisation. So that was a big shift. And so I've seen material shift of organisations. We've got some world-class organisations in New Zealand, and we've got sectors that have made some really transformational improvement. But as a country overall, we've still relatively allowed ourselves to drift over that time. So we've probably quadrupled our national investment from a public and a private perspective, size of team, size of regulated board agendas. So there's been a lot of activity. I think what the statistics in our outcome performance data would suggest, just nowhere near the level of material outcome or performance change we've won out of it. And so for me, it's been a really interesting, it's both a meta-national level, but it's as true, I think, for organizations. If just caring a whole lot and trying real hard was enough, if passion was enough, dare I say it, we would have been able to have translated that significant step change in investment to material improvement. Instead, it's been very, very incremental improvement after a massive increase in investment. So how much and what is important, but the how is critical. And I think that's where I think we've left. And so we've got short 3-year government terms in our national electoral system, which means attention spans, perennially short political attention spans, are even nano length in New Zealand. And so rather than maintaining a strong national consensus that actually this is good, whether you're on the left or the right, this is good for business, it's good for the economy, and it's good for our workforce and communities, somehow it's drifted. And as the shadow of Pike River has lengthened, and there were questions about, did we actually fully understand why the mine exploded, and have we fully held to account the people involved? And I wouldn't even want to imagine the grief of the families still involved. But our legacy of Pike River is one largely of emotional family grief, not institutional change. well, I think I may have shared with you when we spoke. I was in Aberdeen at the time a Pike River movie came out last year, in sort of September, October last year, and it was the, I think, 30th or 35th anniversary of Piper Alpha. Major, I'm sure on this is a group of people that will know that event, but 65 plus men, almost exclusively men, I think, burned to death or drowned, 30 plus bodies never found. And I was talking to operators and industry and the regulator when I was there. And what was palpable was there was definitely the emotional grief still. I spoke to some people that remember the calls coming in that night when they first heard it starting to come. So there's very visceral and real. And that I recognized. It was very Pike River. Do you remember when that happened? But what was so apparent in that conversation in Aberdeen across that oil and gas sector was, and that's why our asset integrity is such an important discipline for us to get right. That's why these safety case regimes really matter. That's why an independent regulator is a really important tension. So it went from grief and systemic change. Whereas my disappointment of where we've landed in New Zealand around that is we've not managed to sustainably embed the institutional change. We still tend to be anchored in the individual grief, and that's not to diminish the individual grief. And I just think it's a very interesting national perspective of what I think is true in many organizations. Bill loses his leg in the forklift area, or someone's killed in a fatality, and all of a sudden, never again. There's this massive investment. There's this short period of time where a whole lot of, DuPont's rolled in or someone's rolled in to do a big deployment. 6-7 years later, the stats are looking a bit better. There's a new chief executive, a new board. Well, why are we investing in all this stuff? It doesn't even look like it's a problem. Because we've done that stuff. Pressure goes off, focus goes elsewhere, complacency or normalization of risk re-enters, and progress is lost. So I think, again, how do we manage this idea of tensioning between both the substantive material, systemic elements of this, as well as plugging into appropriately, remembering that grief, because that grief is powerful. It's just not enough. And equally, the system is absolutely critical, but it's not enough. And so good, effective organizations in the UK, to their credit, have to be held up as world leaders in this space. I think, broadly speaking, have managed that tension at a national regulatory level really, really well. And I think there's some really insightful lessons for us in our respective more enterprise roles, is how do we, as the old saying goes, never waste a tragedy or an emergency. How do we use those memories effectively and respectfully, but not get stuck only in this? Because I'm a bit of a Simpsons fan, Mary, bit of a shameful declaration on such a highbrow podcast as this. But I often think of Reverend Lovejoy's wife, whose sort of catch cries often, "Won't someone please think of the children?" And it's sort of this plaintive, silly cry from the sidelines that doesn't mean anything. And I kind of think there's a level sometimes that we over rely on trying to shame and grieve people into caring. And actually, in a way, I don't kind of care how much you care. I care what you do. And I think that a moral, emotional piece can fall really clumsily on some people, and it evaporates. It evaporates. And all of a sudden, it's 5 generations ago, and I don't even know those people. How do we extend and continue those? And in our Aberdeen around Piper Alpha, I saw that.
Well, I'm sure that our listeners are going to think twice before they say that they're passionate about safety again. Not that you're, yeah.
No, I mean, I am passionate.
You've given them so much more to think about in terms of passion and its role. What is it really, and what is really needed?
And it's important. I just feel like when I jokingly said at the start that I fell into health and safety by accident. I mean, no pun intended. I did. It was an opportunity for me to work in policy. That's what it was. And then all of a sudden I realized that health and safety is this most incredible ethical, moral, legal prison to look at work through. I have a level of mandate, and all of us do in our roles, to be curious about the work our people and our organizations do and enable like no other function in the world. And I just think if we can infect through sound evidence and contextually well-positioned perspectives that excitement in our executive teams. You're not going to do you're not going to do a field visit where you're going to be talking to people about dumb, difficult, dangerous, and difficult things, the 4Ds out of the HOP model, because of safety. You're doing it because you want to understand work. And guess what? You get that right, you get some other things right. 4Ds and asking questions in a way that lets people understand and answer because they're talking about their work, not about the quality of their controls. You are interested in the quality of controls. Ask them about the work. You're actually modeling psychological safety, not talking about psychological safety. You're doing it. And I look at that, and that's why every now and again I think, God, it's got a time for me to move on to something new. And I just go, where else do I get this opportunity? So I just feel incredibly grateful of the work that safety affords me to do. But increasingly, I end up talking to organizations around operational excellence, and what is involved in being Rob Fisher said to me, François, I can show you a safe organization that's going broke, but I'd struggle to show you an operationally excellent business that hurts people. And I just go, yeah, I don't know a single national economy at the moment that's not hungry for growth. I don't know a single organization that's at any level of profitability is pretty hard won at the moment. And so when we can bring in the safety and well-being of our people as a contributor, an enabler, and a driver of that growth, reduce rework, increase retention, better engagement and innovation, count me in. I think it's hugely exciting, challenging, but exciting.
Do you have any resources for listeners if they want to learn more about, the topics were pretty varied, but are there resources that you recommend to people that you think are really valuable?
Yeah, so the forum's website, do we say dub anymore? Or does that instantly make me a boomer? I don't know. But forum, forum.org.nz is our website. One of the proudest things of us being a not-for-profit is we don't have a paywall for any of our resources. So if you go to our website, you'll get to see me and my team and my board shining faces smiling back at you as you go through it. But we've got a raft of case studies, that grid power painting case study, Transpower, that's on our website. We've got a really video resource. We've got some takeouts. We've got contractor supply management. We've got mental health, mental well-being case studies. We've got some core frameworks around the CEO's role around mentally healthy work. We've got some really, really useful frameworks around board monitoring. So there's a wealth of resources for you to be able to, anyone to be able to navigate through. It's pretty straightforward. They're all open and free. So I'd say don't just watch them for yourself. They're all tried to be developed. Our Kiwi accent will either endear you or shock you, one or the other. I'll let you decide. But we've tried not to be too jurisdictional. We're talking about this through the fundamentals of effective leadership and performance. So I think there's what I'd call Aesop's fable morals in all of our stories. So think about how some of those resources I know you could use for toolbox talks, for executive team and board engagements. Think about how you could, not just that's interesting, but what questions could you spark off your organization's reflection on what do we take out of that story? And they are crafted for an executive group. And the other advice we reference it on our website, but it sits on the New Zealand Institute of Directors website. You can get to it through our website. Is a good practice guideline on health and safety governance, taking into account the view of officers having a legal duty, quite a high legal duty. And what's quite interesting is it's a governance document for chief executives and for directors, but it borrows and leans heavily on this idea of safety as a positive outcome of work going well around critical risk control. So what it's not is a really, really detailed document. It's got a very simple governance framework and some really beautiful structure, including questions, and it's endorsed by the New Zealand regulator. If you forget the legal piece and just look at the governance mindsets and practices that it encourages, it is robust, it is world-class, and we're really happy to have been part of developing it. But I think I know I've had people from around the world access it from our website and talk to us about it. So for anyone in any approaching a board engagement, senior executive team engagement, that guide is an absolute cracker. Equally, on our website, there's contact details from me. I'm on LinkedIn, but I love hearing from people anywhere. So through the website or off the back of this, Mary, please, I'd love to hear from anyone. If there's And I'm also open to challenging. I've got broad shoulders, and I don't need to be right. I just share the things that I've experienced.
Okay, so if someone wants to reach out to you, then
No,
LinkedIn or
absolutely.
through the
No,
website. Yeah.
I've never ever regretted connecting with someone that's reached out. It's a no-brainer.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. That's our show for today. Thank you so much for joining me.
Real pleasure, Mary. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
And thanks again to all our listeners, the reason we're here, and the Safety Labs team who do the work behind the scenes. Bye for now. This podcast is created by Safety Products Global, the world's leading manufacturer of safety knives. Through our trusted brands, Clever, Slice, and PHC, we empower companies to prevent injuries by providing safer cutting tools for every material and application. Until next time, stay safe.